Thank you, Julie. I assume that with all that presentation, my fee will be higher this time. So I thought that rather than, and we were just commenting on this before, rather than just having all the time myself there, I might show some, let me see, some things here. And this is from my webpage. And so just to remind myself, to give you a sense of the path. And first thing I want to say is, it's not necessarily a straight path. It's not, and one does not necessarily know where one is going to end. I think there's some streams of things that I've been interested in, and through the years, through the last decades of my work, but I didn't know exactly where I was gonna be at this point. So basically, just to introduce myself, I'm a psychologist, and then I became a family therapist. Originally from Chile, and I came to do my doctoral degree, in the late '80s, and then in the process, I became very interested in things that somehow relate to technology, and but even beyond psychology, and so I also began doing work around public health, family health, etc. Several years ago, I had the opportunity to spend one sabbatical in Spain, actually in the Basque Country, and there I became very interested in how is it that patients get organized online. In fact, we're finishing a book. We were just referring to that before on the subject, and I had been interested through the years, and have since the emergence of Twitter in particular, become very involved with communities of patients, clinicians, researchers who are thinking about the impact that technology has in healthcare, but particularly in terms of what we call the e-patient. That is, what do you do when you're a patient, and it can be acute or chronic, and how is that you interact with others, and how you gather information online, etc., and then how that might change how clinicians provide health. So that process led me to think beyond my field, which is how is that families are impacted by technology, and in some way related to some of what you've been writing, Julie. So how is it that there's this circular relationship between the affordance of technology and ourselves, and how we are constructed. I mean, the fact is, how is it that I'm in New Orleans, you're in Silicon Valley right now, and we're having a conversation that's going to be screened for folks in USC and maybe somewhere else. It's a product of that, not only the affordances of technology, but also of how we have changed in the way we think about relationships with others, right? And so understanding that, which is fluid and changing, led me later on, a few years back, in 2015, to set an invitation to do some work in Chile, thinking about how is it that people organize online after an emergency due to a natural disaster. I come from Chile, and for those who are there, can see, locate themselves, and in a coastline that is sort of like similar to California. In fact, I mean, to the coast of, it's sort of like, if you turn around, it's very similar to what happens between California and Vancouver in terms of if you flip the map in the reverse, right? So Vancouver weather coast might be very similar to the bottom of the Patagonia, and then as you go up, as you go north in Chile, or as you go south in the western coast, you have that kind of weather, that kind of redness. That the Pacific is similar. We are exposed to earthquakes. The difference is that Chile is very narrow, and most of the population lives very close to the ocean, in fact, or to the mountains, to the volcanoes. We have volcanoes, we have rivers, we are exposed to tsunamis, etc. So we have the largest ever earthquake ever recorded in the world history, etc. So that I came to Chile to do work related to trying to identify who these digital volunteers are, these people that in some way do good work online and during a crisis in terms of filtering information, sharing information, systematizing it, making it available to the public. And that line of work, which I'll talk more about it, led to thinking about how we can develop a platform for people to interact during a crisis. I'll talk more about that today. The other piece of work, and I went there for just 6 months, but in the process, I got some money and some grants, and I got more. They asked me to be more in charge of a team, and so now I've been there for almost 3 years. Hopefully, continue a few more years, maybe traveling more there rather than living there. But basically, doing work that relates to how is it that information communication technologies and emerging media. I like the term emerging media better than ICT. How is it that they can be leveraged for helping people coping with a disaster, but also preparing, mitigating, educating themselves, etc. And that led to doing work using drones with communities to enhance people's participation and how they assess risk. And although through the years, I become more and more, how can I say this? More and more back to thinking that the context where you are at, the infrastructure that surrounds you, the territory, the ability, the opportunities that in your life define more of that resilience. That in some way, I think the individualistic psychological emphasis on resilience, that is the way we tend to think of, how is it that people are so um, so special, right? So in a way, I've been thinking more and more about how is it that community develops a more resilient context. So even if you are not, completely, for many reasons, you might have a strong disability, you might have, you might not be able to hold a work, you might not, let's say that you have a lot against you, that still the context is so resilient that you can still do well. Which is, what happens in real developed countries like Denmark and Finland and Norway, where, I mean, where, it really not all depends on quote you, right? So that's one line of work. And then the third part of work that I've been doing, it's more related to communication of, related to the subject of resilience and vulnerability and risk. And so one of the things that I'm doing, we've been writing a graphic novel, and I'll say a little bit more, which in some way intends to capture some of the scientific knowledge, but particularly trying to capture how is it that people can be more resilient and not just victims of what is happening around them. Um, I'll say more about that, but basically, I assume that most of those who are going to listen to this might be familiar with the idea of the modality of graphic novel. Basically, a graphic novel, it tells a story about anything. It could be a biography, it could be a scientific concept, it could be just and fiction, it could be nonfiction, using graphic elements, and it could be a comic. So Superman, it's originally, or the Marvels are basically comics, which in some way could be considered graphic novels, but novels tend to be more in the format of a book, maybe online, but generally we are thinking of a book that has more of an artistic sense too. It has to have hopefully, it's something that you want to go back and read and use. And one of the nice things about graphic novels is that it's something that uh, can, you can explain some complex concepts without having to read a long text. So you can combine some writing with, a diagram, or, and that has to do also with discovering that I could, in some way become much more interested in art, and as a way of expressing some of the complexities of what surrounds us, and that could be extreme natural events like an earthquake or a tsunami, um, or to explain or to think about climate adaptation, climate change, a drought. As you are suffering a drought. Chile is also suffering a terrible drought for decades already. I mean, and how the climate is changing around, and also how is it that we are modifying our environment at an accelerated. I mean, it's not just in terms of. I mean, we are changing the earth, so to speak, and it's going to destroy us. So, how to think about those complex uh, ways of thinking, not just beyond the peer-reviewed journal article, beyond the, the old textbook. And in that sense, even myself, I have discovered that I can paint, and actually in this website, there is series of paints, and it's interesting because a lot of these paints are about territory, are about trying to capture, in a very weird way, I guess, our surroundings, and also how it relates to our internal life. Anyway, but this talk is not about this, so let me go back. Mhm. Right. Mhm. Right. Right. So let's talk first about let's first start. Maybe we can start with the graphic novel, which is so again, I go back to the issue of where is Chile, and so let me see if I can. What is that I need to share here? Yeah, I need to share something else. Okay, so let me find it. Um, here. So this is this is the. I mean, the graphic novel is going to be a book that opens sort of like in a horizontal way, so like it will be fairly large, so to speak. Not large that you cannot have in a seat, but it will open horizontally. And basically, in general, the book, it's a story about this little girl that is in this postal card, and the idea is that this girl. This is some of the graphics and the working. We already have. Well, we have the schema for the whole book that I'm doing with a designer artist. But in the process, what we do, it becomes a research work. So for instance, for this first chapter, we interview a historian, a disaster historian who works in the center where I am, and we to learn about the history of fires in Chile, but also some of the earthquakes, and then in the process trying to figure out, okay, so what are the major events, and because the idea is to have this little girl who is like 12 years old, um, and everything is inspired in some real stories, of course. So the idea is to have her evacuate a city that goes on fire, and there was the largest ever fire in Chile in 2014 in a city. Many thousands of houses were burned and people died. It was really bad. So this is the story of this girl who had to evacuate one of these hills, and then as she evacuates, then she has to move to another city to be with her grandfather, and then we're going to have her go to the north and deal with the issue of what happens when the territory suffers all sort of extreme natural events, but also is exposed to contamination by mining and the destruction of the territory, and then she's going to go to another place. So we have her traveling to 4 or 5 places in the country, and in the process then getting her back in this time, 4 years later, we're going to have her be back being older, 16, 17 years old. And the last chapter is going to be, she's going to be a volunteer working with me. So I'll show up in the last pictures of the book. So, and the one of the things about graphic novels is that they tend to, sorry, I just went, where should I have, okay, whoops. Okay, so it's that, they have autobiographical aspects to it. My grandfather was a fireman, and in that region actually. So we have the name of someone there having the name of my grandfather, and we're projecting people. And we have artists who are going to do little drawings. They're going to be as murals in the graphic novel. They're going to be winks of a lot of things, and we're going to have some infography. So, which are ways of communicating that are that can deal with complex concepts. So each chapter we have an infography about something. So yeah, and I hope that in fact I talked to people in the United States. We might have it translated and actually maybe do a little documentary related to this, which is for the next stage, because it's pretty universal in terms of telling a story about what happens with disasters. And in fact, again, for those of you who are in California, a lot of the images are going to be completely similar because in a way, we have bushfires, which become, city fires in some cases, and villages burn. It's very similar to what happens in California. And then there's droughts, and then there's landslides, which you also have in California, and then there's always the expectation that there's going to be an earthquake, which could happen anytime. And without planning. So our plan is to have this book in every public school in Chile and in every public library. But the idea, to be honest with you, is that it becomes a book that anyone will buy in a bookstore of any age, and they will find it interesting. Like any, like a good graphic novel. I just gonna show you. I just got, a book on climate change. Which is a cartoon story on climate change, and so there are a couple of them about New Orleans. Right. I was at a meeting at the Resilience Summit in Boston last month in March, and so I presented some of these ideas, and very well. So there is this the American Resilience Project. They do documentaries about resilience, and it was interesting thinking they were very interested in some of these ideas, because in a way, the graphic novel is easy to translate into some sort of a documentary. Yeah, and if you think about it, you could see this page in a website. One of the things that is important is that it cannot be just digital. Maybe, that I'm doing more material things with paint. I realize, a lot of people don't necessarily have complete access to digital. They might not have access to a computer, in fact, because most people are using maybe cell phones. They might not have access to a good internet connection, etc. So I'm thinking about, if you were to click in any of these elements here in this drawings, we get you to places. So if you click on the TV, you can get to the news of that day. You click here because they're talking about how the smoke is making her to have asthma. So we click and go to an asthma something. The functionalities of hypertext are enormous, but for a lot of people, that's not necessarily how it might be good for you and I, maybe people who are going to be listening to this. But a lot of people still are adapting to this notion of multiple sets of information that come from hypertexting, because in a way the web still is dealing with hypertext as it was conceived even before the web was invented. In this notion of clicking and getting to some place and getting lost, so to speak, that experience. So yeah, so I want to say that here, again, the graphic novel is a great tool, and for someone who is in psychology, for us, to be honest, all the time I'm thinking, okay, someone reading this, will they understand? So, for instance, just to give you a sense, this is all draft still, but think about this thing that is coming out of this TV news. So I said, well, no one is really going to understand that, because most people will, when they see text on the TV, they will see it the way CNN and most news outlets do it, with this thing that moves, right? So when I have to change that text there to something that moves, sort of like resembles what really happens on a TV set, which is not what is happening in that TV set, right? Oh, I got into graphic novels, I don't know, 2 decades ago. So it's a medium that I like. Maybe because I was so busy, I couldn't read as much fiction as I wanted. So I started to pick up graphic novels, which are, they're great company in a when you're traveling, and because it doesn't require the amount of concentration that a novel might require, and it's also a break from the academic reading, which can get extremely boring and generally badly written. I think it's serendipitous. There is a lot more people thinking about graphic novels. I think it's a medium that has grown a lot. I think there's something about the tangible thing. Analog still matters. I mean, I think that and in some way, analog is changing based on what we're doing digital. But I think that there's something about a real material thing in your hand. Yeah, or with a group. I mean, it's easier to have 20 kids and for someone to open the book or going around and reading than to have a screen. And it also helps you focus better, etc. So there's a value to it. Graphic novels are hard to read. Well, there's some, but to read in a Kindle or an iPad, very few people use anyway. I think that still we haven't got to a place where I do think that in the evolution of things, maybe in 5 years, we're going to open this and this is going to become somehow digital. I mean, how many people use iPads to read books or Kindles? Not a lot of people. Yeah, it's a form of interaction too. If I write something, a book, how are you gonna autograph a digital? I always wonder about that. I mean, in fact, Kindle doesn't have that yet. I mean, what it will be to, yeah. Okay, so that's one piece. And again, the idea here is to capitalize also on evidence. I mean, there's a narrative, but we really want to also be able to share some scientific evidence. I mean, soft and hard scientific evidence, so to speak. We in fact know very little about these natural events. Still, it's hard to, the level of uncertainty is super high. You cannot predict when there's going to be an 8.0, for instance, in where you are right now in Silicon Valley. I mean, there's going to be one, but who knows? Maybe tomorrow or in 300 years. I mean, we don't know. The level of uncertainty is very high. All right, so let's move to the next thing. So one of the other projects that I've been involved is the development of a platform that has sort of like two aspects to it. I mean, it has a public and a non-public aspect to it. And basically, it's called InfoCrisis. And in the idea is to develop a platform that will help the general public to find information that flows online about an extreme natural event. And I don't know if you notice that I say usually extreme natural event rather than saying disaster. A disaster is never natural. A disaster is always social. It's always also unequal. It's always, disasters are preventable. You cannot prevent an extreme natural events, even fires. I mean, fires are a natural part of our environment. If we were to able to differentiate what is natural at this point, I don't know. But it's a large conversation, right? I mean, but the basic thing is, so how we can, I hate this word, but leverage the digital capacities with what you need to know when one of these things, when a crisis occurred. And so the idea is to have something public where I find information about what's happening, how I can help, what are the rumors that are circulating, and what is information that is proven and what is not, to find out where to call if I have a need from a health perspective or whatever. And also where I can go if I need to evacuate, things like that. And to make it, in a way like a graphic novel, as, easy to, I mean, this information is available in the internet, usually. But the problem is that it's very difficult to translate. It's not GIS well located. It's not, it's hard to, it's hard to, right. And also all these things require a level of digital literacy that not everybody has. It requires a level of literacy, not even thinking about the digital part. The digital is an additional one. So I'm going to show you a little more detail around this. Let me stop this chair here and find something else to share. So one of the things we did, and is in designing this platform. Let's see if I can play it. All right. So, okay, let me. So yeah, this is what the public will see, and this is what people who are maybe more connected will see, because the idea is to have something for the public and also for what we would call a community of practice. I don't know if people are familiar with the notion of community of practice, but basically communities of practice exist online and also face-to-face, and also their mixes. But generally, communities of practice are enabled by the online environment. Is basically a group of people that group together around a specific issue. It could be anything from, I don't know, building model trains to helping an emergency to whatever, learning something. And there are some famous ones, like there's software that's been open software that is usually developed by communities of practice. This community of practice will be constituted by people who have become sort of like experts on emergencies, or who we think are more knowledgeable about these events. This is a proof of concept, and this is a diagram of a proof of concept. I don't know if I can prepare it, but basically a proof of concept is something that now we are ready to start with a pilot, develop. This is really still the front end of the platform, not the back end. So again, it has a private side and a public side, and this is the schema of things. One of the things that we have done, even though it's still a proof of concept, we've been thinking a lot about who is our audience, who's going to use it. And we had done a lot of focus groups and testing and questions and whatever. And so we think about one, it would be just a normal person, any person in the country. And then there's the digital volunteer, which will be a reduced group, will belong to that community of practice. Then the reporters and the mass media. And then anyone who's worried about what's happening in that particular zone with the crisis happening that will usually involve people who are in the emergency business. So, there are different characteristics and therefore different ways in which these different people, we've been thinking a lot about what is they going to use in the platform, what are they going to do, etc. The most interesting part for us is the digital volunteer. We building this platform because that's what we learn from interviewing these digital volunteers, doing this profile. And one of the things we discover is that these folks do a lot of things that in some way there's one place they can do it. So they might connect via hashtags in a Twitter. Some might have a group in Facebook. Some might use Slack, those who are more familiar with using technology. Maybe some others use WhatsApp, etc. So, but in general, these are folks who in some way are trustworthy. They have gained legitimacy online, and they're not in the emergency just to gain followership, which is not unusual. Or they're not bots, and they're not, people who are just, there because using the opportunity to anchor their own marketing thing, would be self, it could be company, etc. So one of the things that happens is that the idea is that the platform should activate also these volunteers. So, I might be, for instance, on a train or a bus, and I might not have access at that point to any maybe mass media, but something happens 300 kilometers from where that person is, but that expertise of that person in that bus with a phone might be very helpful to channel, filter information. I mean, there are folks who are, they know, think about the explosions in Paris. That was 2 years ago, I think. And, there was a lot of photos of fires next to the Eiffel Tower circulating. Well, there are people who see that photo and they can immediately say that's fake, right? Similar to what happens in the bombing in London, in Manchester, etc. There are folks all over the world, and they might not even be located in that area, who can distinguish what's a Photoshop thing or something that happened in an event 10 years before. You always have what we call the sharks in the sharks during flooding. I don't know if you every time there's large floodings, there's a photo that shows up sharks in the roads, so to speak. Those are an extreme thing, but there's still people who believe those things, and they usually scare people, but they circulate. So how do you quickly disarm rumors? It's something that is done, but it can be done with a much more effective way, and we can help reporters who are usually pretty lazy. In general, mass media is quite lazy. They don't do their work. They don't, the other thing is to sort of think about tools that we help people to figure out if something is true or not. So here in this thing, I don't know why I cannot move the cursor on top of this, but you see there that little thing there about some on your right side, that there are options. So let's say that this has the flavor of what might be happening in Twitter, but it could be Facebook or others. In this one, we're giving people the option to say, is this true or not? And more important also is this useful or not? Because one of the things that people think about, all right, so we can crowdsource if this is true or not, and that might not be so difficult, in fact, particularly if you have a trustworthy community. But then, okay, it's true or not, and sometimes even something that is false might be thought by some people as useful in a weird way, or not useful. So we want to categorize some of these news or things that are circulating online as, are they helpful or not? Sometimes there are news that continue to circulate days after. It doesn't really matter if they're rumors or not, but do they matter? And then to know if these things are being shared. So one of the particularities of this crisis platform, different from others, is that it's not just based on machine learning, and they're not just based on an algorithm. We're really trying to combine the crowdsourcing, people action with machine learning, because we hope that the machines also learn. And that's, so in a way, when we did a research on, I can show you, we won't have time today, but we did a research on all the crisis platforms that have been developed in the last 5 years, and most of them, the majority of them, really are not designed for people to participate, even though that's central. Um, they don't help leveraging people's knowledge, and I mean, who will know better what's happening in the corner than you who live there, right? And or why would you have to wait for some emergency people, 5 people, or other experts to arrive? A few people can quickly say, "Hey, this is what is happening, and this is what might need to happen." So the platform is designed for that sort of um, you know to figure out. So here, for instance, the structure is, with the idea is to give people quickly what's happening. So you see this in 5 seconds, and you can figure out what happened, how serious it is, what is it that we know really, and who contacted, who should I contact it with. We know that we know that our phones, and I think I said this last time I talked with you about this, so time ago, maybe a year ago, is that we know that our phones, even if we do not type something, they can provide a lot of information about a crisis anywhere in the world. I mean, the phone companies know if something is happening somewhere, anywhere in the world, just based on people picking up the phone, the movement of the phone. We know that something's happening. Right, right. And also any emergency. I mean, and also now there's a gender issue, because a lot of women carry their phones on their backs, so they're always moving. Male phones, actually, people that most men do not carry their phone in their although now people are carrying them in their hands all the time. It's very hard to, but when you have a large quantity of phones moving, standing in one place, something's happening. And you can quickly narrow what's happening. I mean, imagine how helpful phones are to study evacuations. Well, one of our researchers got the data in some areas, so that we know what is the regular movement of people, and therefore, when there's drills, you can study how people make this, go in directions. But here's the thing: very urbanized places are very hard, because in general, if you're going up or down, you're still located in the same place. It's interesting. So there are limitations to it, but it can be very helpful. I mean, in fact, businesses use this all the time. For instance, where to locate a Starbucks you can just look at this data and figure out where it's more traffic. Where do people stop? Where do people look? You have a business and you want to figure out where to put Wi-Fi, wireless connection, free wireless connection. Just, you can just follow people around and figure out where you always connect to the phone company, and people stop, and you can quickly figure out, oh, maybe I can put here a business that has free wireless. Or where do people stop to look at a window? It might be a place where you can put a place where you can do loans. I mean, etc. Or a phone company. I mean, there's ways. You don't need to ask anybody. Just, honestly, I do not know that research, but I'm pretty sure that it exists. So, yeah, it's a whole thing, and that's independent of your activity online. I'm much more interested in the activity. In the one of the things that I'm also very particularly interested in relationship to this, it's that we should be able to help people to think beyond the crisis. So we are designing this for something that people can get educated around, and also to think about having conversations about risk. The fact is, talking about disasters and risk is a pretty boring subject. Most people don't want to talk about it. Most people don't want to think about risk. We worry about risks that are not real risks. I mean, think about, you know, how much effort and energy we spend on people being checked at the entrance of an airplane. I mean, what is the probability of that, right? But then we don't think about things that really kills us, you know, like, I don't know, cold viruses, you know. I mean, why is it that we don't do more around that, even though there are tens of thousands of people that die every day, I mean, every year in the United States because of cold viruses that are preventable? I mean, those are preventable, you know, there are things that are not so preventable. So in a way, our conversation about risk are, and that there's a lot of research around that. They're sort of like almost ridiculous. So in a way, how do you bring people coming back to this platform to have conversations about risk and vulnerability and also resilience? Because it's how do we build resilience, right? So now the stuff that I just spoke about, the graphic novel and this platform, are sort of like national. They're in a way they're distributed efforts, right? They are, hopefully they will reach large communities, and they're somehow disembodied. I mean, so the other project that I've been very involved and I've been fascinated in the last 2 years, is more than 2 years actually, is using aerial robotics and most well known as drones. And that, you know, that has to do more with my interest in, you know, these cutting edge technologies, and not just drones but cameras too. How to think about those 360 degrees cameras. I mean, in fact, we are surrounded by cameras all the time, everywhere. I mean, in these days, it's very hard for you to walk on a street and there's not a camera actually filming you. Driving a car, most cars are all the time being taped everywhere in the world. Actually, it's not just in the United States. So we are in a surveillance place. I always say that that's very dangerous. At the same time, is who cares, right? But that's the case. So one of the things that that I've been very interested in, this idea of thinking about how do we use drones, which are extremely attractive, to help people to think again about having this, so like, quote, as I said before, boring conversations about this conversation about risk. And in a way, this is what we call the drone lab, and this is a very, I'll show a little video which I think in itself will clarify things. But basically, the drone lab has sort of like two aspects to it. One is the one you see at the left, which is activities with the community in vulnerable territories that are exposed to multi-risk fires, flooding, earthquakes, tsunamis, etc., with vulnerable communities, usually marginal communities where they have very bad services, where there's low levels of literacy, where, you know, they're poor, and they don't have access to all the access we need in terms of good electricity, good internet connection, good water, good roads, etc. And they might not have good work around, etc., etc. So how do we use the drones as a way of capturing with the community a new way of thinking about risk? And so elevating a drone with the community, from, you know, doing festivals with drones with the kids to whatever, and then really doing a topography, sort of like a digital cartography, sometimes called community cartography, where you first, you know, have a sense of the territory from the top, and I'll show you some how that might work, and then using that information to have conversations with people. So that's the community activity, and I'll have a video about that. But then the other part is that, as you know, there's I always forget his name. You know, there is what is called the digital humanitarians movement, which born out of the work of this guy in MIT who's an expert on drones and also on the use of geographic information systems in a distributed way. And they developed this whole technology to drone after a crisis. So, but we are much more interested in the educational part, in the preparation, in the mitigation, and the empowering of these communities to use these technologies to have conversations among themselves, but also to be able to engage in a more efficacious way with government agencies, NGOs, as about their territory. So so that's one piece. The other piece is that, again, there's a lot of people doing drone flights, some legal, some not, some good, some not so good. But there's a lot of information that is very difficult to access. So what it would be, that's what is on the side, on the right side of the diagram here. How do we develop a platform for people to deposit drone images, maps, etc., and how that will be a way of interacting with those folks, but also for researchers to actually process that information and make it available to communities at risk. So we are in the whole process of trying to develop. We're beyond, in this one, we're beyond the proof of concept. We are actually beginning to develop the back end for people. We're going to use it for our own researchers first, but also a few others, to a place where you can deposit this data, and then for people to interact and be able to process that data and then make it available. So let me show you a video, give you a sense of the community part. Let me see if I find it. To find it easily, but Zoom is wonderful, isn't it? I love this technology. That one I like. All right, so let me show you this video, and I'll stop it to comment on it, okay? Because it's pretty much self-explanatory. So I'm going to lower the music a little bit. So this is the city of Valparaiso, the second largest city in Chile. It's a port. It was one of the most important ports in Latin America, and actually in the world, before the Panama was constructed. And it's located in an area where, we're exposed to tsunamis, fires, earthquakes, landslides, everything you can imagine. And it's about an hour and a half from the capital. And an important place, actually, in terms of, culturally too, etc. It has some of the geography of San Francisco, in fact. And we call it Little San Francisco. Some people call it Little San Francisco. So what you will see is part of a project. We basically, the Drone Lab, my colleagues and I, we supported the work of others who were trying to pave a particular road for people to be able to walk. This is a very hilly part of the city, because people didn't have much accessibility. Now, this drone is one of our drones, actually, the images that you see. So showing you where the place is, and it shows you one of the activities we did in January. We did a series of activities in this community. So the first activity was to do for people to actually see the drones, use ways of seeing it with those visual, virtual reality things, and they were able to see in real time what was the drone doing. But besides that, as you will see, the drone actually captured images that were then processed into maps. So here we are in a very, as you can see, precarious place. We have to install this tent, bring electricity, and have, as you see, people interacting with those drones and being able to see their place from the top. And also we had students helping us to record what's happening, interviewing people, because this is also a research project. It's really a participation research project, asking people about what they thought about the activity, what they thought, etc. So Then the second stage was to transform these images into maps, what they call ortho maps, ortho photos. And then the second stage, and another day, we went back to give back the information that we have collected the first time. And for that, we had an interaction with people there. And again, we are projecting this in sort of like this, again, very makeshift kind of tent, and having a conversation about what we did the last time. And then you will see how they will work with those maps to locate what we call points of resilience and points of risks. So in this activity, we are basically sharing information, sort of like the information that is being collected with the drones. But then now we are also again collecting information about their social perception, their perception of risk. So we use these, big maps where people put stickers of different forms of risk. So we collected this information, and the idea as we collect the information is to then scan these maps and transform them again into new maps where we could see the points of risk according to the community, but also discover other things. One of the things we discovered in the process was that there was a lot of sort of historical relationships between the people that live there. We discovered that how different their family members were connected, etc. As you can see here, they're putting these icons on top of the map about things that had happened in the past, but also things that could happen in the future. Later on, after processing these maps, we get them back to them, and to create these sort of like collective maps. And these are the maps that you can see they're being processed. Those green slots. I mean, these are the people. Those are the people who participated. Then we locate the neighbors and the friends of those. We did research around that, and then we're going back with this material, and actually we are preparing other sort of things that we can continue that interaction with them. So this is sort of like a social cartography of the way the risk, the perception of risk happen for these people. All right. Okay, so I'll stop here. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting because there are several apps, experimental, different apps related to figure out how, the whole augmented reality thing, which hasn't developed much in the last maybe couple of years. It was pretty much hot like 5 years ago, maybe 4 years ago. You remember this whole idea of you're in a place and you know what's behind the building, and gives you information about if you're a tourist, give you information about the city, etc. The problem with that again is that generally they're designed in ways that most people don't really get it. And so again, here we're trying to sort of like, yeah, it's I don't know if you remember Clinton. I mean, Bill Clinton's campaign. Most people listen to this will not remember that because they were kids maybe. But remember, Clinton's campaign always said, "Is the economy stupid?" And that was the whole thing about thinking about that campaign and how they won. And whenever I talk to technology people, I said, "Is people stupid?" Because in general, and that's where psychologists have a huge. We are in some way much maybe aware that it's about the people. It's not about the technology. The technology shifts dramatically, and one of my big fights is when I talk to computer people, software developers, and engineers, etc. And we start thinking about back end and actually front end too. Their obsessions are not what do matter to the person who are using it. And I always have to remind them that it's about the people. So right. So people say, well, there's this step and that step and that step to log in. And I say, well, how are you going to get people to log in? Well, we can produce a little something instructive to log in. And I say, well, forget it. If I need an instructional, if I need a guide, that's bad. And that's bad for any software. In fact, if you need instructions, I mean, forget it. And so, but beyond that, I think that we um, people who develop this stuff sometimes, and it's not there's sort of like a good intention, but they forget the need to think about the real people use and where you're going with it. And in fact, here's where some of your students who are preparing themselves for this completely unpredictable world, if it exists actually, um, is that that's a yeah. Um, yeah, it there is about the people. I mean, I'm thinking about, I've been reading about how what does it mean that, I think that there was this self-driven car that crashed into someone or whatever. And I thought about two things. One is, well, you should have predicted that was going to happen, right? And if you had predicted what you should have had immediately the story that it should be attached to that, rather than self-driven cars are dangerous. The fact is, we are dangerous driving cars, and we're dangerous, right? So you cannot say that to people, but it's like planes. I mean, and there's a study that shows that airline pilots make like 5 errors per flight or 10. I don't know how many. So, but the planes are designed so that there's a certain amount of errors that can be committed, like 50. A pilot basically doesn't need to be good to fly one of these big planes. So the engineers of planes have designed planes so that, assuming that pilots are stupid, or they would have stupid moments. That's true for all of us, So they should have had a plan for that crisis communication. So because most people will think, oh wow, you saw, I told you, whatever. And, right. Or what are you going to do? I mean, I use Uber or Lyft or whatever, and I have conversations with drivers, and they talk about, when I ask them, I always ask to provoke the questions what they think about taxi drivers, and they think, well, they're going to disappear. And then I always say, well, you too. Um, and they say, why? Well, yeah, because you are a test for self-driven cars. I mean, that's all. You're basically you're no, you are a test for the companies, for Uber and all this. Who knows if it's gonna be Uber or Lyft or whatever, for what will be cars that driving. They need to figure out all the technology to they're it's an investment in that technology. So how, I mean, I'm thinking about going back to the drones. I mean, the way I started was, okay, so what do we need to do for every community or every territory to have people, the people who live there, to use technology during a crisis? So, for instance, imagine every community being able to fly a drone and transmit information that is relevant at that particular point for 5 people, for ambulances, for anyone, to actually save people. But that's true not only during the crisis itself, but also in terms of reconstruction, in terms of the flow of help. Think about in California, right? If all those, okay, absolutely, we always be limited. Yeah, exactly. Right. So think about suburban California. communities, what if they had the ability to fly a drone when a fire sparks, rather than waiting for someone to go and check it out with an helicopter, which is dangerous and expensive, rather than waiting for a fire truck to come in, etc. You know how? So for that, you need certain knowledge, not only flying a drone, which is getting easier and easier. At some point, you're going to tell the drone to fly, and they're going to fly, right? But the platform and how to interpret the data and how to think about the ethical aspects of flying a drone, how to think about the, how you repair it, how you're going to think about, etc. All kinds of things you need to think about. For that, you need to develop knowledge, right? And again, is the people stupid? It's not the drone. At some point, those technologies are going to be like turning off and on the light. You're not going to think about it, just going to use it when it's needed. So the same, how do you think about this cutting edge technology as not being cutting edge, but as being part of what you do, in ways that help those people? But I think that one of the things that because it's about the people, that maybe we haven't figured out is that the solution is not going to be technological. I mean, so a lot of these, all of these social problems are not. They don't. Technology might enable some things, but they're not technocratic solutions, right? I'm always thinking about people complain, oh, you shouldn't be walking with your phone because somehow there's accidents happening. Well, you're gonna start need to design sidewalks for people who use cell phones, because that. So maybe it's cheaper to try to design that than to try to, quote, educate people around it. Because in 2 years it might be something else. I mean, remember when the big thing was people using phones when we're in restaurants? I mean, no one answers the phone in a restaurant anymore. And you don't, it's very hard to listen to one.
No one answers the phone, period, anymore.
Well, yeah, maybe that's true. I've done stuff with the traditional study, but I'm not in the world. I mean, I'm not doing the work to convince other psychologists at this point. So, well, first, psychology is sort of like so vast, right? I mean, it's like a whole world, and there's so many different things happening. But most of psychology is quite traditional, I think, and still studying something that they're still based on the idea that something in your brain somewhere that does something. The little guy or little woman inside you who's, sort of like moving things, and let's study that. And I'm less interested in that. I'm going to say something. I do not think that our behavior is explained so much by internal something going on. We're much more responsive to our environment that we want to think about. And in some way, I do think that we're much more similar than we want to think about. Even though we hate some others, we are much more similar. We have some of the same fears, some of the same insecurities, some of the same desires, some of the, et cetera, et cetera. And they're much more related to your life circumstances and your relationships and your context that surround us. And so I think that it's hard for people to accept that. And at the same time, I think, this is like I mentioned, so like superficially at the beginning when I said, well, what's natural and what is not natural? How are we making the distinctions? I mean, there's so many things we breathe, eat, and deal with every day that we might have thought they were natural, but they're not. They're product of our interactions. I mean, what we eat, for instance, or what we breathe. I mean, um, so I think in general, psychologists want to maybe put my activity or some of my colleagues, because I work with anthropologists, I work with architects, I work with computer people, and or reporters, and I mean, I think the more one moves to the problem that we're trying to address is much more interesting. And so I'm going to more conferences that are related to the subject rather than to a particular profession. It's interesting. In the meeting that I'm attending here, it's a small group. It's the Family Process Institute thing. And I was talking yesterday with one person, another leader in the field, and we're saying, well, I'm not doing family therapy. I'm not thinking in family therapy, which is my main training, what most people know me for. And but I'm going to the basics of what was happening in family therapy in the 60s related to thinking about complex systems, but seriously. Thinking about how hard it is to intervene, because interventions lead to other problems. I mean, a lot of the problems we have in the world today were solutions thought out earlier. Think about contamination, just to give an example. I mean, a lot of the things we do to quote resolve what's happening is just getting into deeper waters in others. I mean, it's not that we don't have to do anything, but we often do not think about the larger consequence. I mean, think about, well, wars are an extreme example of that. Going to war, bombing people, and killing people, and they're just they're not solutions. I mean, they're just going to create more problems. And there are easy justifications for them, but what does it mean? I mean, I'm always, and I won't have time in my lifetime to think too much about it, but think about water. Water is the most scarce important resource in the world. I mean, people fight for water. What are we gonna do about it? It's much more serious than a lot of other things we worry about, and it's not a technological issue. It's how we use water, what we use it for. Um, yeah. So yeah. So, and at the same time, I'm more and more in tune with. That's why I started with these platforms and the larger thing, but also it's so important to be able, as professionals or as researchers or whatever the area you develop your work, to think about how you're going to make a difference in that local place too, because that might give you some lessons about how to think about the larger issues. I'm not going to resolve the problems, whole thing, but maybe we find some bits and pieces in that local work that that it's helpful and inspiring for others.
Thank you so much, Gonzalo. Your work is so inspiring, and you're doing just such cutting edge work with technology and psychology. And I really appreciate you spending your time speaking with us and talking about your career path and really inspiring the students to think outside the box in terms of what they can do in their careers.
Thank you for the invitation. Hope this was helpful. Have the I'm actually, you might be interested in, send me the recording. I think there were some interesting things that came up.
Of course, and maybe you can slice it up into some pieces and put it on LinkedIn. I think that would be great.
All right.
Thank you so much, Gonzalo. I really appreciate your time, and
Thank you. Thank you. Take care. All right. Bye bye.